Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Hopefully you're not too sleepy post sandwiches. I'm really excited to make it down here to the coast today from the northeast or north, I guess, west corner of New England to talk a bit about my research in sugar bushes in Vermont and how this sort of interacts with bird habitat and other sort of questions of well-being with communities in the area. So to the uninitiated, when I refer to sugar bushes, I don't know if this is good yet. Yes, okay, cool. So a sugar bush is a forested stand that's used to collect sap. Like the keynote speaker was saying, it's good to know where food's coming from. This is sort of where our maple syrup is coming from, largely in Vermont. So these are forested stands throughout the state, throughout sort of the northern woodlands in general. And they're often sort of characterized by these networks of tubings that take sap back to collection areas. So I just wanted to give this sort of context as I'm going through the rest of this talk. So really quick summary, I'm just going to talk a bit about the conceptual framing of this research, dealing with ecosystem services, how we value those services, and how it can potentially incentivize management for multiple ecosystem services in forested landscapes. Talk about what we don't know, especially in the peer-reviewed literature sort of universe, the methods and sort of analysis and conclusions. I did want to caveat, this is research in progress for my dissertation currently, so take some of the numbers with a few grains of salt here. So to begin, I wanted to dig into ecosystem services, benefits, and values, and these are terms that you're likely familiar with, and if not, I just wanted to sort of familiarize everyone, get everyone on the same page, because I think it's easy to sort of conflate these terms, especially thinking about this research. So ecosystem services are sort of one piece in this sort of complex chain between biophysical structures or ecosystems and the benefits that they provide communities sort of across the world. I'm just going to use one example to sort of walk through this sort of ecosystem service cascade that's outlined here. And so on the left, our biophysical structure is a photo of the of woodlands, in Vermont. This is sort of a northern hardwood forest, which is pretty characteristic of most of Vermont. And the function I'll be dealing with, or sort of focusing in on in these woodlands, is that of sort of biomass accumulation, which is represented here by my poorly taken tree core. But this biomass accumulation essentially just means that there are woody vegetation existing in forests in Vermont and throughout the northern, throughout New England, that can yield a variety of different ecosystem services. So these services can be really, binned further. So it can be provisioning services or cultural ecosystem services. And I just wanted to give a few examples of just handful ecosystem services that can come from these types of habitats. Things like standing merchantable timber, bird habitat, or sort of the presence of sap in different trees, which is of relevance to all of relevance really to my research here. These services are then sort of benefited different ways by different communities. So when thinking about standing merchantable timber, this timber can be milled and further processed into lumber that then provides shelter. That would be an instance of a benefit from that service. Or those who are able to sort of go out and recreate and benefit from sort of the enjoyment of just seeing birds in their habitat. And then in the case of sap, so we can further produce that or further sort of boil that down, into maple syrup, which we all know and love in the Northeast. And then talking about values, so valuing these benefits that come from ecosystem services, values are often sort of denoted by dollars and cents. Again, as sort of was nicely framed in the keynote talk today, there's also this sort of deeper meaning in relationships between people and nature that often doesn't really come to the surface when we're considering the values that the values that we impart on the benefits from ecosystem services. So all of this is to say that this research that I'm carrying out right now looks to sort of make sense of this mess of a linear model here, but basically that, it's important to know that communities benefit from nature in a variety of different ways. And it's important to sort of understand the differences amongst different communities. All right, now thinking about forests in particular, different management approaches can ultimately kind of go back and influence function or sort of the biophysical structure that then functions and yields different services. So understanding management approaches is kind of this field of study that's pretty widely popular, at least again, I know in the spheres I'm working in sort of understanding management approaches from landowners has been really sort of importance. Just knowing that values can potentially drive management approaches. And this is particularly of interest to New England because it's a highly fragmented forested landscape. In Vermont, in particular, about 60% of the forested lands are owned by non-industrial private owners. So what happens in these forested areas is really dictated by sort of the values or importance that these individuals get from the woodlots or sugar bushes that they manage. It's really important to kind of understand things at the people level too. Okay, so working forests is this term that sort of really well captures sugar bushes. And so working forests is this idea that people can manage landscapes or manage forests for multiple different types of ecosystem services. And this is a graphic from Northern Woodlands magazine. A colleague of mine at UVM named Alan Kosiba sort of outlined this idea, and this is sort of focused on carbon, but how you can sort of manage a woodlot in different ways to both maximize carbon, but then can also sort of maximize services like habitat for wildlife and birds, and potentially timber, and potentially even sap production too. So it's important to kind of think about how we can manage in ways that do maximize types of ecosystem services. But it's also important to note that that's costly for the folks that are taking this management on as well. And so payments for ecosystem services schemes are a sort of policy lever that has been used in certain instances and has been rolled out in more agricultural settings in Vermont. But it basically are these programs that look to recoup the costs or incentivize managing for multiple ecosystem services. So someone's going out of their way to sort of take a wooded stand and make sure that all these different services can potentially be benefited from by them or communities. These programs look to sort of pay back the managers in different ways. This is where birds come in. So in my work, I am teaming up with, or I have teamed up with Vermont Audubon because they recently, like I said, in the last 6 or 7 years, have rolled out this program called Bird Friendly Maple. And so the Bird Friendly Maple program has this set of guidelines for sugar makers that if they follow these guidelines, if they pledge to follow these guidelines, theoretically will yield sugar bushes that are A, good for bird habitat, but then B, probably good for carbon storage, probably good for water filtration, hopefully good for sap production as well. We're trying to tick all the boxes here, or the program is at least. However, it's not a true payment for ecosystem services program in that there's no direct compensation beyond the ability of producers to put a funky sticker of a scarlet tanager on their jugs of maple syrup. So there's a couple different research projects currently going on right now to try to understand how well this program is working and whether or not people may pay a premium for something that is produced in bird-friendly habitats, sort of like organic, for instance. Catchphrase of this is that if you're thinking of maple production on two ends of a spectrum, this is a very dramatic example. I believe this is from Cornell, but there is the risk of when favoring sugar maple species, especially in our neck of the woods, no pun intended there, that there can be a maple monoculture that results. And they grow really well in our region, and they can outcompete other tree species. So the program tries to stay away from that and really try to incentivize diversity and complexity with woody tree species in sugar bushes, which may come with costs too. All right, so what don't we know in the research world? I broke these into different inputs and outputs just for clarity's sake, but we don't know a lot is sort of the bottom line. We don't know really what forest management approaches that sugar makers are taking, both in the state and kind of at large in the maple sugar making region in the US. So we don't really understand or have a clear understanding of what approaches people are taking and what costs are associated with these approaches. Like I was talking about payments for ecosystem services and trying to incentivize multiple ecosystem services. It's important to understand what those cost inputs are when thinking about trying to incentivize on a financial level. Then we also don't have a clear understanding of the values that sugar makers may hold and how those values may interact with or inform management decisions on the ground. Again, like that graphic with the sort of cyclical arrows, we don't have a clear sense of what values are at play here. I won't talk about this today, but there's another graduate student colleague of mine who's working on impacts of sugarbush forest management on forest structure, function, and biodiversity. I'll just give a quick plug and say that they recently published a technical report on a few different properties that they surveyed across Vermont the last few years. So I'd be happy to reference you to that at the end of the presentation if that's of interest. All right, so I am sort of trained in the social science research methods world. So I'm really looking into the people aspect of this kind of resource use issue. And so my study population is sugar makers in Vermont. So sugar makers in particular are sort of interesting because they often own or operate. They're kind of the land managers for these wooded areas. And Vermont is of interest because it's the state that produces the most maple syrup out of any state in the country. Kind of funny because it's almost the least populated state, but I guess that doesn't surprise too many people. About 2.5 million gallons were produced in 2022, and I believe this trend is just continually increasing. And I'm accessing this population through contacts that I've made during my time as a graduate student in Vermont, but then also through the state trade organization, which is called the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, kind of a mouthful, as well as NOFA Vermont, which is the organic certifier kind of arm that many landowners work with, and a variety of different landowner nonprofit groups. So I'm using a survey as my data collection tool to sort of get some of these data points from sugar makers. That's a physical survey, and then also have an online survey that's going out through certain listservs. I'm also doing follow-up interviews, qualitative interviews with folks who are willing to talk a bit more and just give more context about some of the answers they provided, which has been a really cool part of the research because I get to drive around the state and sit with sugar makers and just get them to tell me stories about what they love to do. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide because it's super wordy, but basically just wanted to point out that I have a couple different bins of data that I'm collecting with this survey tool. I'm going to focus on 3 of them for the rest of the talk. And that's different management approaches that sugar makers are taking, the costs that they are incurring by these management approaches, and then values that sugar makers hold in relation to their management approaches. And so I'll kind of go through each of these with the following slides here. So as I said, these are preliminary results, so numbers hopefully may change as things go along. But as of now, I have 43 participants that are in 12 different counties in the state. If anyone knows their Vermont trivia, I am missing 2 different counties, one in the Northeast Kingdom, Essex County, and then one in the southeast corner, Windham County. But generally, we're getting a decent spread of sugar makers throughout the state. Thank you. And so what management approaches are these sugar makers taking? So in general, we're seeing that people are managing quite a bit in their sugar bushes. And often this is under the auspices of a forest management plan here. forest management plans are often the prerequisites for things like tax abatement programs. So this isn't a super surprising finding, but we're also seeing that sugar makers are also, trying to retain and recruit snags and get wood, and then also sort of limit harvesting in bird nesting season. So not going out to harvest in May, June, and July, when many interior forest birds sort of migrate through sugar bushes. Also interesting to note that these 4 management approaches are specific to the bird-friendly maple program, whereas the ones on the right are often prerequisites for being organic or just having a forest management plan in general. All right, what costs are associated with management? So I kind of lumped these together and found that there's about a $41 per acre per year cost that is associated with different forest management approaches. And so I've broken these costs into variable and fixed costs. The variable costs include harvesting, managing for invasives, damage costs, labor costs, and then the fixed costs would be forest management plan, which lasts for 10 years until you have to certify that again. So $41 per acre per year doesn't sound like a ton of money, but a 300-acre sugarbush operation isn't uncommon. That means these producers are spending about $12,000 per acre or per year on forest management approaches and the top of it. I also was able to sort of compare costs between those who were enrolled in the bird-friendly maple program, that's what BFM means, and those who are not enrolled in the program. And we're finding that there is a slight differential between these two sort of enrollment types of about $6 per acre per year. So again, taking that 300-acre example that I just said, folks that if there are 2 different sugar bushes, one has 3, that are the same size, but one is in bird friendly and one isn't, there may be a differential of about $2,000 per acre in forest management costs to be parsed out further on. But I tried to break this down even further by different types of costs. And we're seeing that even though there is a differential, and it seems like those enrolled are paying a bit less in forest management overall, they are investing more in harvesting, damage, and forest management plan related costs. And damage, I think, is really interesting to note because this emphasis on leaving dead wood as habitat trees, things like that, might ultimately sort of serve as an opportunity cost for income for the producers. So another finding of note here. Fly through this, again, no pun intended, but we have values as well. I had folks rank what values are most important to them and what really are most important to their management approaches. And we found that stewardship, place attachment, heritage, and identity were of most importance to sugar makers, whereas health, spirituality, knowledge, and beauty are less important. Place attachment is interesting because it's not uncommon that folks lease land from others. So there may be some sort of agreements that folks have to work with when they're trying to manage accordance with their values. So the qualitative data that I'm collecting, I'm trying to sort of tease out the relationship between values and behavior and whether or not really sugar makers are able to sort of manage in accordance with these values that they said are so important to their operations and to how they live their lives. And whether or not that's even something they think about. So future analysis plans, I'm going to try to group these findings and sort of run different analyses on whether or not folks who are most aligned with a heritage sort of identity or a heritage value, whether or not their management alignments differ among property histories, among certification type, among ownership type. So there's ways to sort of parse this data even further to just get a sense of whether or not this stays true, this importance, this value that people hold to their sugar bushes, whether or not that ultimately sort of drives management approaches that may impact functioning in future services down the road. So again, what I'm seeing, just super quick conclusions, is that forest management costs account for sort of a fraction of the total operational costs, yet appear to differ among bird-friendly or not groups. And that sugar makers value their forests sort of beyond monetary worth. So there's sort of a variety of ways in which people value the benefits from the sugar bushes. This is sort of important when thinking about future forest conditions in Vermont, but then also sort of the northern forest in the aggregate. Quick acknowledgements to my project partners, to funders. I work with Audubon Vermont, also the Audubon or the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and again, sort of a wide array of nonprofits through the state that have sort of helped me to get plugged into the sugar making community. So I'm happy to field any questions or take any comments, but yeah, really appreciate you all coming in and